Welcome back to Inclusive and Online with Kate and Dan.
I'm Kate.
And I'm Dan.
Today's topic is inclusive course design.
Inclusive course design seems like a fairly broad topic, which it is. Just like digital accessibility, which we discussed in our last episode, it can seem like an overwhelming challenge.
Our goal for this episode is just to have some general conversation and identify some first steps for listeners to start designing inclusive online courses.
A great point, Kate. We don't mean to overwhelm our listeners, but rather offer some initial guidance on the topic.
That and offer some practical first steps.
That's right. For example, in earlier episodes, we've discussed the importance of correct name pronunciation. We've talked about LGBTQIA plus inclusion and gender identity. And really, each episode we've recorded so far speaks to inclusive course design in some way.
I'd like to challenge folks to consider how students with various intersecting identities might experience their online courses. For example, how will a student who identifies as transgender and disabled experience your course? Will they be able to access all of your learning materials? Does your class have relevant examples that include diverse gender identities?
Well, there are clearly many things to consider, but that need not be a deterrent to get started now. And to help us out, we're excited to be joined by our friend and former OU E-List colleague. We'd like to welcome Jess Tess-Navarro to the show.
Thanks for being here, Jess.
Hey there. Thanks for having me.
So, Jess, tell us about yourself and what you've been up to since starting your new position.
Yeah, so my name is Jess. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I live in Southeast Michigan in the Detroit metro area. Currently, I work remote for a global company called Dematic. They focus on automation supply chain. So the courses that I've been working on are quite technical in nature. They're fully online. And as you mentioned, prior to this role, I worked with all of you wonderful people at E-List, also in an instructional design role. And so I would say that my experience as an instructional designer overall has been pretty evenly split between higher education and various corporate work environments.
As an instructional designer, what comes to mind for you when someone says inclusive course design?
Yeah, and like you said, this really can be quite broad, and I think we all bring a very personal, experience to, what we have in mind with that type of, idea or concept. So for me, when I sit down, especially when I'm trying to create a new course, I try to keep in mind or imagine learners with diverse needs and backgrounds. And so as you already mentioned too, I think this overlaps quite a lot with digital accessibility. So I'm really glad that you've started to approach that in a previous episode. I do have to say that often when I think of inclusive course design, I can't help but keep in mind the experiences I've had as a learner in the past in a course or a learning experience that I found, somewhat or maybe quite a very uninclusive.
Yeah, I can absolutely think of times in my undergraduate education where an instructor would say something that didn't feel inclusive to, for example, diverse relationship structures. And that's something where at the time I was very much struggling with accepting myself and my sexuality, and hearing those kinds of things not represented in my classes was also something that contributed to that struggle.
Yeah, I think for me, it's, being white, cisgender male, oftentimes the examples we would see in classes would, relate to me because, I'm very part of what that, normative society, that idea of it is. So as different aspects of diversity and inclusion started working their way into the curriculum or finding a way into the curriculum, I did notice that. And in further readings in current times, it's pretty clear that there's still a lot of work left to do to try and include different perspectives, different work experiences. One example I have is that I've not sought out, but I've also not seen in many textbooks in the human resources department, for one, about the experience of a transgender employee and how that works for the organization, how that works for the employee and what that dynamic looks like. Now, that's just one example of, say, a step a professor could take or a person could take to try and get a more diverse perspective into their classrooms, is to seek out those types of articles.
Sure. I was going to say that I feel like these are the types of things that once you're aware of them, it's really hard to unsee them. I can also think of a recent example. Just this last summer, I was taking a Spanish course. It was completely online, and a weekly activity we had was to go through these online vocabulary flashcards. And this was through like a third-party vendor, textbook website. I'm sure that the whole department was required to use. But the topic for that week was, STEM and the sciences very loosely. We were getting introduced to, that type of vocabulary in the Spanish language. And so out of like 100 vocab cards, maybe 30 of them had representations of people because they were, vocabulary words that had to do with, roles or jobs or those types of things in STEM and the sciences. But out of those 30 cards, they only represented one woman and one with a Black man. Everything else was completely, white men. And as I'm going through these cards, I just felt myself more and more distracted by this lack of representation. And it really took my focus away from the learning experience, which is, I think, what we're trying to avoid when we try to center inclusivity in our course design.
Yeah, and I do think it's important to mention that I don't think that these instructors are doing this intentionally. I think that there are a lot of resources out there that were created that just didn't keep necessarily this inclusivity in mind in their development. And we're not here to criticize anyone. We're not here to tell instructors that they're not doing something right, but we are here to give resources and ideas for instructors who are ready to make these steps and put the effort in to make their courses inclusive.
With June being Pride Month, I see a lot more activity on social media centered around, pride in general. And one thing I thought that was an interesting was one of my friends who posted a comment. I don't know if you ever thought any of us would see it, was that, relating to sports teams in the Detroit area, and that one of the teams updated their logo to include, a rainbow colored background on it as well. And this person commented, not my friend, saying that it's okay. You can be with who you want to be with. You just don't have to cram it down my throat or rub it in my face. And my friend commented back, you mean like how they do with heterosexuality? And I just thought that was, a really, fun point to see from one of my friends in a forum I don't typically see him dipping his toes into. So that was, interesting to me, is that oftentimes in educational materials, I feel the same way, in that we see it just really, what we have been taught to be considered the norm is what we almost always see in a lot of the textbooks. And to Kate's point, I don't think that's intentional. I just think that there's more work that needs to be done to create more inclusive educational content.
Yeah, and it's great that your friend spoke up, but I definitely think the power dynamic in, the classroom or in courses can make it really difficult for learners or students to feel like they can speak up, even if they are experiencing, something in that learning environment that's excluding them.
So we've talked about just kind of different pieces of inclusivity and in different intersections of identity. Why do you believe that inclusive course design is important?
Yeah, it's important to me, and I think it should be important to anyone who's an instructor or a course designer, instructional designer, all these various titles. Centering inclusivity really is trying to help learners be successful. I would say it's integral to student or learner success. We all bring our whole selves to the learning experience, whatever it may be. And it never feels good. No one wants to feel excluded or like, part of themselves is being ignored or even disrespected. I think as, instructors or people who design course material, we want the stress in the course to be that good type of stress that we experience when we feel our abilities being stretched or, our assumptions being challenged. that good feeling of growth, not that stress of having our identities somehow, misrepresented or disrespected or whatever we may encounter in a non-inclusive course.
And I do think that you kind of addressed this in your past response, but why should others think that inclusive course design is important?
I think they should find it important because it's not obvious, basically. And I think, some of Dan's comments really spoke to that. But I think, that's going to be true for any of us, depending on where we, find our identities intersecting, that we all have blind spots, we all have biases, we all have things that aren't obvious to us. And that, I think, is why it is important to find this topic important, because it's not something that you're going to be aware of, you're going to see at least every version of it naturally. It's something that we have to put work into to become aware of and do better.
It's a great point, because for me, I can walk into any room and most people say, well, there's kind of a portly white guy walking in right there, but that doesn't really speak to every aspect of my identity or the ways that I, could potentially feel included or excluded within that environment. So it's those things that we don't really see or know, that sometimes it takes someone a little bit of time and comfort to express, that portion of themselves. So yeah, I agree. It's similar to digital accessibility in that we don't know if a learner coming in, has a need for a screen reader, or if they need, or if they're low vision, whatever, that may be. But we're really making a determined push to make it so that that student doesn't have to, feel excluded from the learning experience, that this is a place for them in this classroom, in this learning experience at this university. So I love the point that we have to be mindful of those things that we can't really see in designing our courses.
Yeah, I think that's super important. Just in the sense that you're being mindful of these things that you can't see. And I think that that's even more prevalent when you're teaching online classes, because then you are getting much less direct face-to-face contact with your students in general as well.
Yeah, as the instructor, you can potentially be getting a lot less, feedback, especially through potentially facial expressions or verbal participation. I think when our learners or students do give us feedback on this, it's a gift. It should be embraced. But I think, a majority of the time, we're probably not getting that feedback, and that learner may be, suffering in some silence.
So we talk about that classroom experience and educational materials, needing to catch up to that, and faculty adopting these types of resources. Some might say my textbook already has a chapter on diversity or on women or on culture or on international organizations, or whatever it may be. We already cover that in the book. So what more do I need to do to be inclusive in my course? How would you respond to somebody with this concern?
Yeah, I would start by responding by saying that inclusivity shouldn't be a single chapter or a single moment or a single conversation, within a classroom or a learning experience. It really should be permeating the entire experience. A single chapter in a textbook that's focused on diversity of some kind, it doesn't do anything to prevent the potential harm or burden of a lack of inclusivity in the other chapters of the book, in the other, materials that are being included in the course, in the conversations that are being had around class content, around the spaces that these learning experiences are happening. Just like we mentioned, we have these, various months out of the year, right? It's Pride Month right now, but Pride or Black History Month or Women's History Month, having these month-long events doesn't mean that we are solving, racism, sexism, or homophobia in our society at any time. So really, I would say it's nice to have a single chapter or something be a place to start, but hopefully that's just the beginning.
When I hear the word inclusive, I think that means everybody, as we've been talking about. And the concept of trying to address every aspect of human identity in a course can be pretty intimidating. So what would you say to someone who is just getting started with inclusive course design to help alleviate some of that anxiety?
Yeah, I would say that everyone starts out overwhelmed if they're approaching this, with good faith and good intentions. So, you're not alone. And the good news that there are, I think, a lot of resources out there. So no one needs to feel like they're reinventing the wheel. When it comes to the tools we're using to create our course content or materials, there's a lot of great things like built-in accessibility checkers, that can help ensure your course content is more accessible. There's a lot of great frameworks out there, such as Universal Design for Learning, which I'm sure at one point you guys will probably focus a whole episode on this topic, for starting to think about how you are going to approach the design of your learning experiences. Probably a first great point I would recommend for anyone is to find some type of learning community with their peers to join on this topic. And that could be in person or virtually, but a place you can go and you can hear about what other people have been doing or what their concerns are, or what they've encountered or mistakes they've made. I think it's important to just start somewhere and then keep it up of improving your course over time. And most importantly is accepting when you start this endeavor that you will mess up, that's part of the learning process, just the same way we would want any of our students to, accept and learn from their mistakes with some grace. We need to do that too.
Yeah, and we've been saying on our podcast as well, is we are going to make mistakes. We don't know everything, and we're going to do our best to be willing to learn from those mistakes, accept feedback. And I think that that's what everybody needs to do, especially when taking on one of these new challenging endeavors that you've never necessarily thought about before.
Absolutely. And kind of tagging on to that question, what can instructors do now in order to make their courses more inclusive, and just some of the small steps that they can take to contribute to the long-term success of the course and their students?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say, obviously doing anything that helps educate yourself, as we were talking about proactively on, the barriers to learning that may exist in your course so that you can start working to tear them down, is great. Some questions you can ask yourself are, are you including diverse voices within your course material, at all levels, whether it's a textbook or your own materials you're creating or things you're pulling in from outside sources, the guest speakers that you're including. I would say too, you can ask yourself, have you checked for instances of bias, stereotypes, tokenism, other forms of harmful misrepresentation, and done what you can to remove them? Are you ensuring that your learning material is as digitally accessible as possible, or are you aware of that? And lastly, I would even say, thinking about, are you providing some form of flexibility in your course for how your students or your learners can demonstrate their learning? I think any of those questions is a great place to start to, put some to-dos that can help you improve your course.
I love those questions. And, if it's all right with you, I think it would be really helpful for our listeners if we could kind of take a bulleted list of that and put it in our show notes for them to reference. Before we move on to our tech tool segment, are there any final thoughts on this that you'd like to share?
My final thoughts would be that, just this is something that's really worth doing, and that in the end, you will be less stressed as an instructor or course designer. Your students or learners will be less stressed. Your learners will be more authentically motivated to engage with their learning experiences, and they'll be able to go farther with their learning. So this is absolutely worth it.
Awesome. Thanks, Jess. So typically, each of our episodes has a tech tool or two that we highlight for our listeners. Do you have any suggestions for tech tools relating to inclusive course design to recommend to our listeners?
Yeah, I can think of two of them. The first I did briefly mention previously, which is that there are actually a lot of really great built-in accessibility checkers in the tools that a lot of us use to create our learning material. So for example, that would include Microsoft Word or, Google Suite tools like Docs or Slides. Those tools are there to help flag potential issues, especially when it comes to digital accessibility. And so definitely, get familiar with those and take advantage of them. Secondly, when it comes to trying to have better representation within your course materials, there are a lot of really great free stock photography sites out there. And many of them are targeted to specific disciplines or industries or areas of interest. So some of the ones I've used in the past that I think have been great would be the Gender Spectrum Collection, NAPI, and Women in Color in Tech. But really, there are a lot more out there if you just do a quick Google search. And many of them are free.
Well, thank you for sharing that information and for joining us here today. It's always good talking with you. It's good to see you and catch up with you, and glad that you're doing well. So thanks for being with us today, Jess.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I can't wait to hear, all the topics you guys are going to continue to cover in this great podcast.
I guarantee you they're all going to be great.
We'd like to thank Jess for joining us today. If you liked this episode, don't forget to subscribe and rate our show on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, or Spotify. We value your feedback, and your ratings and reviews will help others discover our show. You can also follow us on Twitter at Inclusive Online and Instagram at Inclusive Online Pod. If you'd like to get in touch with us with your ideas, feedback, or requests to collaborate, you can send us an email at inclusiveonlinepod@gmail.com.
And don't forget to take a look at all of our resources for today's episode linked in the show notes. Please note that we are not endorsing or sponsoring any of the products and tools that we discussed in our show today. We are simply sharing our experiences with using these tools, and we do not receive any compensation for mentioning these tools.
Special thanks to our production assistant, Kayla Yuka, and we'll be back next month with our next episode. Until then,
we hope you feel included.